Welcome to the inaugural episode of what Huggy Rao and I decided to call the tFixers. This is roughly a monthly series where we talk to people who are good at getting in and fixing organizational problems. And our first guest is my friend, David Kelley. And David, who for many of you needs no introduction, David is a Stanford professor. He's a chaired professor. The thing I love about David is he's beat the system completely. He has no PhD. He doesn't do publications, but he has done things like started a company that created thousands of products and other changes, IDEO. He's really the driving force behind the Stanford d.school, sort of the innovation education shop at Stanford. And so David is somebody who has always, to me, pushed institutions to the point where I never thought things were possible, and then that kind of change occurred. And you come up with stuff that I still can't believe that you've gotten away with, to tell you the truth. And so the first time I met David, I looked it up, 1993. Wow. So we've known each other a long time. And my students kept doing case studies of this crazy guy with a mustache named David Kelley. And so one of my PhD students and I, one of your former students, Andy Hargadon, and I, we went to see David in downtown Palo Alto. I still remember he was in this office with all this junk in it, all this products and everything. And we said, David, we want to do an ethnography. And he gave us the phone list of IDEO, and IDEO had about 45 employees in downtown Palo Alto in those days. And you said, here's the phone list, stay as long as you want. And we stayed a year and a half, and then I was an IDEO fellow for 20 years, and you still haven't gotten rid of me. So David, let's start out and talk about IDEO, because you and Bill Mogridge and somebody else started IDEO. What was the concept behind that? Because at that time, it was a very radical design firm.
Excuse me, yes. The real truth is that IDEO started in 1978.
Wow.
As a company, David Kelley Design, and then it became David Kelley Design, a very humble title, David Kelley Design.
DKD.
And yes, DKD. And IDEO happened later with the merger of some other companies, but it's the same entity the whole time. Anyway, the whole impetus for this was I had worked in corporate America for a while, and I really hated it. It was really bad for me. They took you and sat you down next to somebody and say, this is the person on your team, and then the project came from somewhere, and the project already had.
You like something this big to work on.
Yeah, and the project already had the solution embedded in the project statement. So what I really wanted to do with the beginning of IDEO was to make it such that projects allowed the people who were working on them to come up with new to the world stuff rather than having it already well defined. And maybe most importantly, I wanted people to have choice in who they worked with.
Yep.
And so I would pick my friends, they would pick other people that they knew that they liked. And so from the center, we built out this team based on who we wanted to work with. It's a completely different environment when you're basically treating the other person as a friend, as opposed to as a colleague. I don't know quite how to describe that, but that's what happened. That was the magic of the early days was, when we needed to do something, it's like, how would friends answer that question?
Yeah,
how would they decide?
So I remember, when I first got there and met you, I was just sort of astounded because because you were a consulting firm and I was used to other firms. Yeah. And you said to me, some client came with an inquiry and you said to him, well, let's see if anybody here is interested in working on it.
Yeah.
And if they're interested, that'll be great. But if they're not interested, then we won't be able to do it for you, which just sort of blew my mind because I was just corporate America, you will do this. That was the whole model, wasn't it?
Yeah, sure. We had an early sales guy named David Haygood, and he would tell potential clients, they say they had this project, and he would say, that project's not interesting enough for me to take it back to the company. And then companies would try to make their project more interesting. It's kind of arrogant, but it wouldn't work in our culture to be forced to work on something. And we were constantly rejecting things. Some people wouldn't work for the military, so we didn't do anything for the military. Some people thought, you know, selling carbonated beverages to children, you know, and so
You'd
we reject those. We were lucky enough to have enough work. I mean, the question is, if we were desperate for work, would we have made
well, I remember that when there was downturns, you would take work you wouldn't take when things were really good, because you got to feed people.
Sure. We were lucky. My mentor, a guy named Bob McKim, said when I started the company that, you know, be careful, because design firms tend to porpoise, meaning they have too much work and then they have too little work, back and forth. But we were lucky enough to have, you know, be the design firm of record for Apple at the time. And so we just had so much work that we could be picky about what else we did.
In the beginning, you were a pure mechanical design shop with a little industrial design, right? That's what because I remember looking at the percentage of people when we first started studying you. It was something like 37 mechanical engineers and 8 industrial designers.
Yeah, well,
something like that.
It depends what you call them. A mechanical engineer, because our mechanical engineers came out of the Stanford design program. So they probably had mechanical engineering degrees, but I wouldn't characterize them as mechanical engineering. And you brought up Bill Moggridge, and that's what happened. So his firm was primarily industrial design, and we were primarily mechanical engineering or engineering. And so we started doing projects together because the client wanted everything done all the way. They wanted about both how it works and how it looks, and so that they didn't have to fight that out, we fought it out. And we just started to realize that it was like an idea to be full service. We could offer industrial design and engineering at the same time.
So Bill Moggridge, for people, so tell folks what Bill Moggridge is famous for. I mean, he invented the modern design for the clamshell laptop, right? The patent for that.
Yeah, Bill was a wonderful person. I still miss him every day. Anyway, his firm designed all kinds. In those days, we were designing all kinds. I mean, all of us were designing new to the world stuff because the technology was just coming up. So I mean, I don't know what the form of it would have been, but it was easy to do something new to the world when there wasn't any laptops, or there wasn't a mouse, or there wasn't, you know, pull down menus or whatever. So it was pretty heady days as far as inventing. And so Bill was working for a company called Grid Systems, and they had the first Grid wanted to design the first laptop, and Bill and his firm designed it. It was a beautiful.
The Grid was like a $5,000 laptop that was so expensive nobody would buy it.
But you in those days you could get the patent for having the keys and the display cover each other to protect each other, because didn't exist.
Nobody thought of it.
Well, there wasn't any reason to think about it because there wasn't any laptops.
Yeah, and so folks, look up Bill's picture. He talked and looked like Obi-Wan Kenobi in Star Wars. And he was so classy. I mean, that guy was such a class act.
I learned a lot from him, absolutely.
So IDEO, okay, and then IDEO, we'll get to the D.school in a minute, but the thing about IDEO was there was this point where you kind of started pivoting from applying design, to products, to processes, into organizational design. I mean, I even remember Diego Rodriguez, who I think is watching now, one of your partners, saying he worked for Steelcase when he was young and designed a table, and then he was helping them design their organizational structure and use the exact same process.
Yes, I think
so.
That's
talk
true.
A little bit about that transition.
So our process is really, we call it human-centered, but it's really around trying to understand what's meaningful to people and how to get things to work well in the people sense. And sometimes that's a product. In the beginning, it was only products, so that's all we knew. But then it started to move towards services, right? You can see how the same process of really understanding what the tray should look like on an airplane and how you should serve the food is very much in the same understanding what's going on with the people in the system. Right. And then we started designing experiences and systems, and we found that our process, because it was so human-centered, for sure, but also because it was so prototype-driven, that we could quickly make something, and it could be a story of a service or acting out an experience, right? And you could just, all the things that were wrong just came out in the prototype, and then we just fixed them. You know, you find, you have in your mind that something's going to happen a certain way, or something's going to look or work a certain way, and then you build a quick one, and you say, oh my God, that you can't walk on that side of that because you'll bump into this, right? And then we can quickly change it. And so our process seemed to have it seemed to apply broadly, both because of how human-centered it was, and how quickly we were willing to switch directions, pivot in a different direction based on our prototyping.
So I'm going to tell a little story, and David knows this is coming. So one of the most amazing things I ever saw you do, and I saw you do a lot of amazing things, but there used to be at IDEO this astounding meeting called the Monday morning meeting, and still the best meetings I've ever been to. There'd be 60 people sitting around, and you would have 60 people like rocking and cranked up. It's at 9 o'clock in the morning and these are like, you know, engineers who like to stay up late. But anyhow, so what David did is David did this reorganization, and what happened, IDEO got big enough that you couldn't just have one big group.
Yeah.
So you broke it into 3 studios, and by the way, the most amazing reorganization I've ever seen. Those of you who are watching this have probably been through reorganizations where you are told, you are reorganized and you are now on this team. Well, this reorganization was, he had 3 studio leaders. It was a Brennan Boyle, who were I'm trying to remember who they, and 2 others. And they made the pitch, please join my studio. So people had a choice of what group they were being put into.
You could go in any studio you wanted.
And people were really nervous about the reorganization. What David did, you can see his mustache. He shaved off his mustache. Nobody had ever seen him without his mustache. And he had this line, and he said, so this organization, it's just like our products. This is a prototype. It's just like my mustache. I can grow it back. And everybody was just blown away by that. And that reorganization, it worked for a while, and then you did something else.
Yeah, sure.
But the thing that I loved about that, and I still think about that, is this notion that an organization, just like a product, is a prototype, and that's what we do at the D.school too.
Yeah. So the thing about organizational changes, I mean, it needs to be done, even in almost all organizations. That's why you have a job. Anyways, we always wanted to be able to say, nope, that didn't work.
Right.
You know, like a month or 2 months in, you could change. Say we were going to do studios, and then we say, oh no, that's not going to work. So we're going to have to break into this kind of organization. But one of the times in our life, we did a lot of work for Steelcase, and one of the big times in our life was this thing of moving from private offices to cubicles,
which is a big deal.
The big deal, right?
Still a big deal.
Or maybe not cubicles was not a good choice, but open plan versus private offices, right? And we're now almost all open plan. Everybody in the planet's almost open plan. But at the time,
there's a lot of evidence that just sucks too, by the way.
Yeah,
but anyway,
okay. But it is what it is. But there, at this time, take a law firm. Everybody was in their own office,
right.
And we had to try to talk them out of their offices, right, and into an open plan. It was a really tough sell. So just like everything else we do, we would say, we're going to try it. And if it doesn't work, we're going to go back to the old way. Right? And in this particular case, most people preferred the open plan with some enclaves so they could have privacy if they wanted. But it was more exciting to be out in the middle.
So I'm thinking of that original concept was cave and commons, right?
Yes, that's right. You got a good
well, because we used to go out and talk with Hackett, who was the CEO of Steelcase at the time. And I think the problem with a lot of the folks who went to open offices is they give you all commons and no cave.
Yeah.
So that might be it. So okay, the IDEO adventure, interesting, fascinating. And the other thing about David is, and I don't even know how you get away with this, but he's like a full professor at Stanford. He's got a chair. He's in the National Academy of Engineering, and he's a CEO of a company. So he's kind of doing all this stuff. But then you get this idea. So it's like 2002. And I remember you used to say, I want to start something that's called the D.school. And we'd go to IDEO. It was like Terry Winograd, Bernie Roth, Jim Patel. And he'd kind of give us wine and food. It was really fun. That's the thing about David. I think I've eaten $100,000 worth of IDEO food in my life. IDEO is very good with food. And I was looking at even my email folders of Kelley's dream. And then one day you came back with $35 million from Hasso Plattner. So we had to do something. So why don't you describe a little bit about the founding of the D.school and your
First, I want to go back and talk about having 2 full-time jobs. I highly recommend having 2 full-time jobs because in those days when I was not at IDEO, they thought I was at Stanford. And when I was not at Stanford, they thought I was IDEO. I could be anywhere, you know. I mean, I could be, you know, out in the Bay. So anyway, I really like 2 full-time jobs as a dodge on being where you are. But the D.school. So the D.school, well, first it was a joke, the D.school, because the B school is such a big deal here. And so we wanted to be funny. And so we called ourselves the D.school. We kept getting cease and desist.
Every administrator told you to stop calling it the D.school.
Except by the end, they were calling it the D.school. But anyway, the notion really came to me was that if you go around Stanford, there's just a lot of people doing something they don't want to do. The professors are teaching classes they don't want to teach, but they have to teach a certain number of classes, so they teach, you know, introduction to chemistry or whatever they have to teach. And the students really don't want to take the classes. They're a lot of them, anyways, because they're required, right? I mean, they would take elective classes, but they don't. So if you just look down from the top, you see a place where there's rooms full of people who don't want to be in those rooms, and that made me think, I want a place where people opt in. They're there because they want to. And so initially we didn't give the students credit for the classes and we didn't pay the professors. So
I remember not being paid to teach.
And I remember you complaining about it.
Yeah, of course I complained.
Anyway, so that opt-in.
But I still taught the classes though.
Yeah, I know you did. You did taught a lot of classes. And so that notion of opting in and wanting to be there for the right reasons was the thing that really got me excited. And then that, you know, we had done a lot of talking about multidisciplinary teaching and stuff, but it really was, you know, we'd go to a meeting and divide up whatever the money was and go back and do what we were doing before. And it was just talk. And I really wanted a place where professors came from all over the university to teach together. And we were successful at that. It was amazing. You know, I don't know, I think there's 50 professors teach there from all over the university.
It's just amazing
every
how much
department, you know.
So I'm thinking of some of the, because David, because this was before any classes, you sort of laid out, okay, so classes are required, none of our classes will be required. There was that. Yeah. Then you had this concept of sage on stage, which means one professor like me just talking the whole time.
Yeah.
And then no, your thing was the professor doesn't talk so much, the students actually have to do something. And
there has to be multiple professors in the room at the same time, not one point of view, at least 2 and maybe more.
And by the way, just having, you know, taught at the D.school and having to struggle with Stanford, so at Stanford they try to give you less credit when you do a team taught class, even though it's actually more work because you have to coordinate with more people.
Yeah.
So there's that. But the other thing, and I think this is getting to prototyping, maybe we can talk about this and talk about some of the things that you're most proud of, because the D.school really does have classes where people prototype products, prototype companies, they prototype their lives.
Right.
I mean, it's just remarkable. So talk a little bit about some of the things that you're most proud of. And it's just right across from here. It's just such a buzzy, exciting place. Still, when I walk in there, I'm like, wow.
Well, you know, it's a lot. It's a lot more exciting than I ever dreamed it would be, and it's been copied, you know, continuously in academia now, and that feels really good. But what the things that remind me, there's a class called Extreme Affordability, and that was like the first class.
You co-founded that with Jim Patel.
Jim Patel, yeah. And just seeing how excited the students were to actually go in country and prototype something that was going to help people who had real needs.
So the concept of this class is before the class, it's a 2-quarter class, you send the students to do need finding all over the world, right?
Right. Well, to whatever they're going to do, you know, incubators for babies that in India or Africa that can't maintain their body weight, you know, out in the villages. And so they're going to go to those places, yes, and do the need finding there. And they're just so excited when the students come back. And, and there's been a lot of companies that have been started out of just that class in the
Embrace. You're talking about the one with the baby warmers. So
yeah.
So tell the Embrace story, because the Embrace story is a great story.
Well, Embrace, the students, I'll tell a couple quick ones. The students went, came to the conclusion that they needed more incubators. That was because there were so many babies that died because they couldn't keep warm enough to maintain their body weight. And so they went over to, I think, design a low-cost incubator. And then, just because of the way our process works, they figured out that it didn't do you any good to have an incubator in the hospital. The babies were all dying out in the villages.
So the problem wasn't to build a better incubator. The problem was to keep babies warm.
Exactly. So they ended up with making something that looked like a sleeping bag with paraffin in it, and you heat it up. And I don't know how many 100,000 lives they've saved at this point, but it was that way. Another one is when I'm blanking on the name of Terry Winograd's class, but anyway, they went to Africa to look at fires. They found that there were these villages where the kind of electrical systems weren't that robust, and so they'd have fires. And they went, and I think everybody thought they were going to do a low-cost fire extinguisher, right? But when they got there and really got to know the people, they were worried about fire, but they were worried about fire for a specific reason, which was their immigration documents would burn, and then they wouldn't be legal in that place, and that was really scary to them. So a fire meant they could lose their home or where they did. So anyways, I'll make a long story short, the students figure out that that's really the problem. They get pickup trucks and get scanners, and they go around and scan all the documents that the people have, and they put them in the cloud. And now, you don't have to worry about your because they teach them how to pull them down. They don't have to worry about the documents burning. It's that kind of excitement. You can see how that would turn Stanford students on to make that kind of contribution. And there's many, many more.
And to me, I mean, let's sort of back up here. And we've already got one questions. Please keep asking questions. But let's kind of go through, because one of the things that's happened with a lot of people picking up design thinking, we were talking about this and getting ready for this, that it's all these messy things.
Yes.
But there's 2 or 3 things that you keep coming back to: need finding, rapid prototyping. What else? What would be
a bias towards action rather than sitting with your laptop in a room someplace? Get out there into things, and then human centered.
Yeah. So the bias towards action is really interesting, and I already mentioned Diego Rodriguez, one of your students, who we've both learned a lot from. And there's this question I've taught with Diego at the D.school, and people say bias towards actions, you're going to screw things up. But Diego always asks this question I love, which is, where's your place for failing? So it's sort of like the difference between crashing in the flight simulator versus the actual airplane.
Yeah.
So how do you get, and you've worked with a lot of organizations that are really resistant to trying anything. Oh, it might screw it up.
Right.
So how do you get them to sort of move?
Yeah. Well,
because you're very charming with this.
No, well, I don't know about that, but what we believe is that you need to do something that Albert Bandura called guided mastery. So a series of small successes. You can't go into to a company and do the kind of wholesale change that we would have in mind when we first got there,
right?
Because it would be rejected, right? Too different, right? And so the trick is to have some like experiments, have some little wins by picking something that's smaller, and there's obvious, we want to set us up for success. So there's obviously a pivot from where the people are thinking they should go, what they're doing now. And if you just pivot a little bit, you get a much better result. And so we start by start by having those little wins, and then people start to notice, and oh, I want to have, you know, I want to do things that way if that's going to be successful. So it's it takes a lot of
So it's
small wins.
So I mean, a good example of that, and I'd love with you to jump in on this. I mean, one of IDEO's biggest clients for a while was Procter & Gamble.
Yes.
And this amazing woman, Claudia Kachka, who we just love, Claudia. So Claudia led this design thinking movement, and it spread throughout much of the company and had a big effect. But I remember she started with the Mr. Clean people because, first of all, they were desperate because they were, Mr. Clean was just sort of like sales were just going down and down. And they were so desperate that you worked with them to help reframe, and you came up with the Swiffer, right?
Well, I'm not sure. I was not on that project, but something, yes, something that was new to the world came out of the dull thing that they had, right? And so, yeah, that's that. I mean, that's not atypical for IDEO or for the D.school. You know, you can go in, and it's part of it is, you know, the leadership being so open at both places. I mean, Sarah Stein Greenberg, who's the executive director of the D.school, is really, really good at getting people to do stuff that needs to be done, and that they feel like they contribute across the board. And so her team is doing a fantastic job right now. I just walked across there from there.
All right. Okay, so we got some question. Okay, so this is Ajit. I don't know where Ajit is. Sometimes companies have a hard time getting buy-in from clients around design thinking, human-centric process. It feels strange and wrong to them. So how do you get them on board? You just talked about doing a little small win.
Yeah.
I remember Hasso Plattner, our donor, the Hasso Plattner Institute of Design. I have one answer, and I'll see what it. So I remember I was at SAP giving a talk, and Hasso was giving grief. I won't name him, but to another executive, and he said to the executive, this is the guy who led strategy, I don't understand a word you say. I understand every word that David Kelley says. So that's one thing you say is you actually speak English. So that's one way to convince them. What else do you do to get buy-in?
Well, I think it's about storytelling. To get buy-in, you got to be good at storytelling.
Right.
And I think in most cases, especially when the product or service has social value, which is the kind of stuff we tend to work on now, a well-done video that builds empathy for the people. If you can picture, if you're the company and you're having trouble buying into the process, if you can show a few empathy-based videos of what's going to happen if we do it this way, it's the human part eventually wins people over. I mean, yes, the company, you know, is worried about shareholder value more than they're worried about taking care of everybody. But you know, it's getting good at storytelling and make quick little videos, painting a picture of the future. I mean, the hard part is when they're having trouble accepting this process. They're not thinking about what the consequence is to the future, because nobody's shown that. If you can paint a picture of what the future is going to be like with these new ideas in it, somehow that's easy for people to. It's like you see science fiction. If you read a science fiction book, it's easy to picture what would happen if that.
I mean, so one thing that sort of comes to mind, to be a little concrete. So in the early days, and I used to think you were nuts, by the way. There's a lot of times I thought you were crazy.
Yeah.
He had this picture in front of his office. He had this picture of Where's Waldo?
Yeah.
And you had people sort of running around in different groups, and that was your vision of the D.school?
It was.
And that's kind of how the D.school works.
Yeah, if you stand up on the second floor and look down in a day when
when it's busy,
it looks like
it's just like Where's Waldo? So what do I know? Because you have these pictures. So this idea of sort of painting a picture of the future and then getting people to live little pieces of it. That's one of the sort of experience prototypes that you guys are really good at building. Students are really good at build. I just even remember, so to tell tales on one of your great students, Perry Claymont, is one of the best teachers at the Stanford D.school. Perry was, he invented the modern snowshoe. He was very senior at Patagonia, and now teaches all sorts of classes. So Perry was
CEO of Timbuktu.
He was CEO of Timbuktu, and our students, we took him up in a bus, and Perry's CEO. He had the worst corporate meeting I have ever seen in my life. And literally, our students were on the bus. We couldn't believe people were falling asleep. They were interrupting. They were confused. I mean, it was really like terrible. And bless Perry's heart, what we did was we had our students come in, and what they did was they had him and his team role play what a good meeting would be. and so that was, to me, that's sort of living the future. And he did change the meeting.
Yeah.
And you are very good at running meetings. Well, Perry is probably good too. But that was, to me, a really good example of our students created an experienced prototype. And the D.school, we put it on the bus, we go to the meeting, we observe it, and then we build the prototype, and then we try to get the user to critique it, and then to live it and try it in the real world. To me, that's the full cycle design.
There are better. I mean, there's science here. That's what you. I mean, there are better ways to run meetings and worse ways to run meetings. There are better ways to incentivize employees and worse ways to incentivize employees. So, if you can get it right, then, the question is of getting them to adopt it. If you can get it right and show some small successes, people move. They don't move 100%, but they move a bit. And then once we're going and there's a couple of successful products or services out there, then it really can take off, because people want to be successful and they see a new way to be successful. They do that. And that's why people like, you're talking about Claudia Kotchka, that's why she protected people in a most people today have some kind of design D.school like place inside of the company. It was called the gym, I think.
Yeah, the gym. That's right. I remember the gym. Yeah.
Anyways, well, that's to protect them long enough to have some successes.
Right. So, and one of the things, to be snide, but one of the things that I used to hear your designers say is, you don't show unfinished work to stupid people.
Yeah.
So there's some people you can sort of show your really crappy prototype to.
Right.
I even remember Bill Moggridge, I won't name the company, but like yelling not very nicely at somebody who had spent like $100,000 on this prototype. He said, "That's a prototype you should have made with paper for $10."
Yeah.
But this idea of not showing unfinished work and making it safe for the idea.
It's actually, it's funny you bring that up. I actually, I kind of measure companies now by how crummy the prototype is that they can take to the CEO. If the CEO is hitting on all cylinders with respect to this, then they're happy to see unfinished work or a crummy prototype. But that's not the way most companies are. If you've got 10 minutes with the CEO, you polish that thing, you make it perfect, but you're not at that point. So now you're at the whim of whether she or he like it. Whereas if he'd have gone in, 2 months earlier and said, "Boss, this is what I'm thinking. There's these three. What do you think?" Yeah, then you would have. I'm sorry, but the CEOs are usually so busy and everything that they're not happy about seeing the crummy stuff.
Right. And yeah, you talk about Jim Hackett, who is CEO of Steelcase and of Ford. I think Jim is somebody you can show pretty crummy. In fact, I remember
he wants to have his say. He wants to have, his point of view incorporated down the road.
Well, I remember, I think you got Hackett hooked on IDEO. He was head of marketing at Steelcase before he was CEO. And he was on a team, and he was there prototyping at midnight with him, like cutting up boxes. You really got him to drink the Kool-Aid. So I mean, this idea of prototyping is interesting. So there's some questions here, and I like this question from May about. There's a couple of questions here about design thinking being a buzzword and so forth. And the interesting thing, in just the years I've known you, nobody knew what design thinking was. In fact, when I first met you, nobody used the word design thinking. And people used to joke maybe it should be called design doing instead of design thinking and stuff like that. And there's been this sort of arc, and and this happens with almost all management movements, where first it's an idea, nobody knows what it is. And I even remember Claudia Kotchka who was one of the early adopters, saying, I'm not going to call it design thinking because nobody would is. I'm just going to call it innovation.
Yeah.
And then all these people adopted it.
Yeah.
And now we have a situation where, let's be honest, in some places it's not getting a great name because
Right.
it's not being done very well.
That's right.
So why don't you
So I
talk
think
a little bit
that's
about the arc of the movement?
Well, I mean, I'm not embarrassed by that. I
No.
think all movements do that.
Quality
So-
movement, same story.
So there was just a big fight about design thinking on our alumni thing.
Uh-huh.
And so it's the part about not doing it well. So if you go up and you kind of slap the word design thinking on whatever
Right.
process you have, then you can say, boy, that doesn't work very well.
Right.
Right. We know, I mean, I'm not going to be arrogant, but we know it works. I mean, you know, we've seen it happen. So maybe it doesn't work
Works
every
at Apple
time.
and Nike, for example.
Works at a lot of places. But now you've got, as it gets to be watered down, let's say, then, yeah, no, I mean, we see people saying they do design thinking and they're not even talking to customers. You know, they're sit in their office with the laptop open. They're calling it design thinking. The same thing happened with, the first thing that happened in my life was brainstorming.
Uh-huh.
So brainstormming.
Yeah,
And,
I
you
wrote
know,
a paper about brainstorming.
Yeah, I remember. And it was very useful in generating lots of ideas. But as it caught on, it began to mean a meeting. You know,
Right.
Pretty
Any
soon,
meeting.
any meeting where you were going to talk about, you know, ideas was a brainstorm. Oh, let's have a brainstormer. Well, brainstormer has formal rules and a exact, you know, layout on how you do it, and it became a meeting. Well, design thinking is in that.
And
thing now.
well, so brainstorming is an interesting example because I mean, IDEO was famous for brainstorming. You had a famous ABC Nightline, the best-selling Nightline video of all times was when you made the shopping cart.
Yeah.
And there was all this brainstorming session and it looked really cool. And brainstorming was important, at least when we studied IDEO. But one thing that Andy Hargadon and I figured out is people spent less than 5% of their time in brainstorms.
Yeah.
It was part of a whole process. So people would say, oh, brainstorming doesn't work. And to us, brainstorming is just one little part of the creative process. You got to have the prototype, you got to test it, you got to revise it.
Yeah.
And maybe you'd have a special brainstorm if you were stuck with a design problem where people would come in and try to fix it.
Yeah.
I remember going to a brainstorm as a specific technical problem and people fixed it. And then we ended the brainstorm after about 20 minutes.
Yeah. So at some point we get to people, you know, like I never use the word brainstorm anymore. I probably won't use the word design thinking anymore. Right. It's just how it happens. But you know, people are really good at latching on to some kind of frame. Right. And so in the early days, the design thinking was really good frame to say, I'm going to act differently. That's really, so and the company's going to allow me to act differently. And that in itself, and then it makes a difference about the process, but that in itself, you know, I'm allowed. And see, people say that all the time about the D.school. Professors from different parts of the university, they say, boy, I walk across the threshold and I know I'm allowed to act differently here.
You're allowed to act different. So I mean, just one test that I use, and let's go look at some of the other questions here, but one test that I use, because a lot of the organizations we work with, because we do teaching at the D.school, so they'll set up a teaching operation where they teach sort of watered down 45-minute versions of design thinking. And they'll say, we've trained one company in particular that was a D.school. I'm not going to name them. They were really proud of training something like 5,000 people.
Right.
And then, so I kept asking the question, and I asked this question for years. Can you show me one product or service that has been changed by design thinking? And they'd always change the subject. And eventually, after a decade, they have abandoned their design thinking movement. And what that meant was they ended the classes, but they never implemented the process in everyday life. And that's what Claudia Kochka did, was actually, there was some classes, but she would find specific products and services and organizational designs that needed to be changed at Procter & Gamble, and her people would change them. And to me, there's a difference between talking about it and doing it. And I think training's really a dangerous thing.
I do
yes,
it is. I do think that sometimes these movements, I'm not thinking about design thinking in general, but sometimes these movements serve their purpose because they allow people to have a new frame. And that, so the one just thought of it was Hackett at Ford had this thing called now, near, far.
Now, near, far.
Now, and so whenever you were talking about a product, or you had to talk about what's the now version of that, what's the near coming, and what's the far version of that. And it sounds like a pretty simple thing, but it really made everybody have a different discussion rather than like work on one thing, work on a new car. No, they worked on the near car, you know, the now car, the near car, and the far car. And so it really set you, I mean, I'm just saying it's just a random example of how having a frame. And I think design thinking was a frame for some people and had some advantage, even if they didn't use it properly.
Okay.
Properly defined by us, which doesn't mean it's proper.
Okay, so there's a couple questions here which I'll get to, but one thing I kind of want to do, we got about, 18 minutes left, is, so one thing that's amazing about knowing David, the years I have, is the number of people, famous people, who have like just been sort of smitten with you. Let's kind of go through and talk about what you've learned about shit fixing, a word you don't like. We can talk about how you would fix the word shit fixing.
I have to tell a story. So when we had a new provost here, Persis Drell.
Our provost.
Yes. And I was at the D.school, and Tom Hanks happened to be there that day.
Hanks.
And she said to me, I said, is this a normal day?
You give me a tour because one of his kids was there. So
his kid was here.
But you being with Tom Hanks is not as all shocking. So we'll start with Tom Hanks. So what did you learn from Tom Hanks?
I learned that you can be, you know, that all that Hollywood glitz and stuff, you can be a completely different kind of person. You can be a really solid citizen who cares about things that are important, like typewriters. And
that's right. He's obsessed with typewriters. There's a whole documentary about his typewriters.
But I mean, he's a really good actor, but he is, having dinner with him, he is just a genuinely nice person. But I don't know how we got off on him.
Right. Well, so let's talk. I mean, Steve Jobs, he was one of your best friends. You were very close to Steve Jobs. So tell us a little bit about what you learned from Steve Jobs and maybe what you taught him too, because you have a patent with him even on the Apple III. I remember that.
Yeah. I don't know if I taught him anything, but he taught me a lot. I mean, any design firm, any designer who worked for Steve, he was their best client. They would tell you for sure, because he cared so much, right? And so what I learned from him was you should do everything to the hilt. I mean, you know, why not care about the box that it's in? You know, why, you know, and so it was great because you could just, go to the most extreme thing you could think of, and he would entertain it, right? Even though he would sometimes say, well, it's too expensive, but he would still challenge you to go back. So some days you were a hero, and that felt really good. And some days you were a heel because he would say, that's not good enough, or I thought you were good, or what, something
tough.
He's tough. But it always was in the process of trying to make something like really much better than you thought you could make. And, I mean, the most famous thing we did for him was the mouse. And he wanted it for, I don't know, $17 or something. It was some number like that. The team could tell you. Anyway, and we were not coming anywhere close to that. And so
it was too expensive?
Too expensive. And so we just kept at it. And the thing that happened there, which is really interesting, was we were trying to make the mouse such that it was accurate, meaning you moved the mouse on the table an inch, and then it moved on the screen 1.00 inches, right? And so that precision was adding a lot of cost into the mouse. And then one time when we were fooling around with it, we realized the human brain's in the loop. If you draw the block diagram, we don't need to be that accurate. You got the human brain in the loop. So if you want to move it from here to this point, the person's brain stops it. It doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. So now the cost just went. And I think that's the kind of thing that Steve would force you to do in order to make his unrealistic goals.
So I mean, he was a complicated character. One person I've talked about him a lot with, not as much as you, is Ed Catmull from Pixar.
Yeah.
I worked with him for 28 years.
Yeah.
And the one thing Ed would say is that, yeah, Steve would get mad sometimes, but the main thing he would do at Pixar is he would push people for pride.
Yeah.
That you want to be proud of the work that you did when you look back.
Well, if you please, Steve, you were proud. I mean, that was for sure.
I remember actually, because I've been around IDEO so long, I remember I was hanging around IDEO when he came back. Steve came back in 1997 as an interim CEO to fix the company. One of the first things he did was he called Denny Boyle, just retired from IDEO recently, he was one of your first 8 employees or so, wasn't he? And Denny, I think, designed 40 Apple products. And one of the things that Steve did, because he'd been gone for a while, was he called Denny and said, "Run me through the Apple product line and tell me what you think of it." So that was the sort of relationship that you had with him.
Yeah, yes, it did. Yeah, and I mean, you all hear all these, stories about how tough he was, and he was tough, and he was difficult to work with. But he's also a very caring person. And he had cancer, and I had cancer, and when he found out that I had cancer, he came over to the house, and he came over to the house regularly, and helped me through making decisions about chemotherapy and stuff like that. And
he'd visit you in the hospital, and
he did,
and he'd nag your doctors and nurses to take care of you. I mean, such a complicated guy, both loving and difficult all at the same time.
Yeah, my surgeon, I mean, who for years I went back to to have him look at my throat again. And my surgeon always retold me the story of Jobs coming in his office and poking him on the chest and told him he was going to do a good job of surgery.
So he had high standards. Well, good, and you're still alive. So.
Yeah, I'm still alive.
So I mean, so that's one of the stories about Steve, is that you hear he was a very complicated person. Yeah. And certainly I wrote a book called The No Asshole Rule, and I do mention that he could be an asshole sometime, but a complicated person.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got about 13 minutes. This one's too fun, from Barrett. Any insights on bringing innovation to the Department of Motor Vehicles? Okay, you can fix the California. Give me an idea.
The truth is, the department, I mean, it's a mess, but the Department of Motor Vehicles made a big leap when they started having appointments.
Right, yeah.
So there's a line that's just as bad as it always was.
Right.
But there's a line next to it that if you get an appointment and are willing to wait until your appointment date, they're pretty efficient. I mean, I was surprised. I'm a collector of old cars, and so I'm at the DMV a lot because, they're always doing different things and getting license plates from the year that the car was made and all that kind of stuff. And I think it got a lot better. But the main thing is the way to improve it, in my mind, would be to make it more enjoyable for the people who work there. I mean, that's
such a tough place to work.
We did a bank for Carlos Rodriguez Pasteur in Peru.
He's like the richest guy in Peru, basically.
Yeah. But it was the same thing with the tellers in the bank. How do you make them? And we did this one little thing, which we put a little like whiteboard, blackboard next to the thing, and then they wrote something on it. Like, I remember one guy wrote, "I want to be the president of Peru," right? Or, "I love scuba diving," or whatever. And then we watched as the people coming up to the teller had something to talk to the teller about.
So it humanizes them instead of being...
humanizes them, and it's that's the DMV needs. DMV needs is for that person not to be. I go, as I say, I go there all the time. I just try to be sickening sweet so that I can get through my process and agree with them. But it's because their job is just not very fulfilling.
So I mean, one example following Barrett's thing it's not the DMV, but it's close. There were 3 different folks who went through the Stanford D.school, who started a nonprofit in Mission called Sevilla to improve the process. I don't know if you heard about this. I think it's an amazing story. Yeah. And what they did was, there's a benefits form for people who get unemployment insurance, healthcare services from the state of Michigan, that about 2.5 million people fill out every year. and it was the worst form in the country, and they made it about a third the length, and they made it much more clear. They just this form, and they've saved thousands of hours. And also, one of the side effects, you talk about the people who work in the social services offices.
Yeah.
They worked really heavily with them. So the number of people who go to those offices because they can't figure out how to fill out the form, even though more people are filling it out, has dropped by about 50%. And to me, that's a, that isn't exactly the DMV, but it's pretty close. It's and people talk about the notion that that government services, well, we have to have them, and they can be better. In fact, one of the guests we're going to have in November here is a guy named Todd Park, who was CTO for Obama. And some of us will remember all the problems of signing up for Obamacare, the terrible website. So he led an effort to fix that.
Cool.
So and to me, that's consistent with design thinking. You prototype, you be user focused, and you get things done.
Yeah, one of the things that's most rewarding in some ways is when you work with the group. You were just talking about working with a social services group, or if we worked with the DMV people, and we fixed it, and it was much better. Just them saying this happens a lot with pride, saying, "I'm the one that came up with this. I'm the one who." I mean, just the ownership of the change is also really important.
Yeah. And the story from Sevilla is that the people who they initially stereotyped as these sort of heartless bureaucrats, they said these people cared the most. They had the most information. These people are the reason that they fixed it.
Yeah.
And because they knew the problems, and there's this great Michael Lewis, the guy who wrote Liar's Poker and all the other stuff. He has this notion that you find the person 6 levels down, and that's the person who knows how the system works. So,
well, I certainly don't want to give anybody the impression that the designers go in and design stuff for other people. The truth is, you co-design it with the people who actually own the problem, right? And so it's those people who as a designer, I don't know enough about the details of how the voting works in Los Angeles, although we built a new voting machine for them. But there are people there, and their knowledge and if you can turn them on, their knowledge plus our methodology is what's happened.
Well, but I love that. So one of the principles that I picked up from David is that when you solve a problem, you want people who know too much and know almost nothing. That combination, and the example I always think of is Jane Goodall when she studied the apes. That she was hired by Richard Leakey, famous anthropologist, and he wouldn't let her read anything about chimps. He just sent her in the field to figure out what was going on so she wouldn't be biased. And that idea of people who know too much, and that's kind of the heart of design thinking. That's why you have a few old farts, and then you hire a bunch of young people at IDEO too.
Yeah, well, experts are really important in the process. And sometimes when you hear designers like me talking, it sounds like we're saying we designed it. We didn't design it. We designed it alongside of the experts who actually knew the stuff, who actually knew the detail of how something works or why something's important.
But I still remember, in fact, I think this is how you got Steelcase as a client, was that somebody was saying, but you've never designed like furniture before, and you made the argument in your charming way that the fact that you had nobody who'd ever done it before, you come in with fresh eyes, and so you knew too little and they knew too much, and plus you had the design process.
Since we don't know anything about chairs, there's a pretty good chance that our chair will be different from other chairs.
And it was. Okay, we've got about 5 minutes. Let's see. Ooh, I kind of like Kaylee's question, because this is a challenge at both the D.school and IDEO. How do you work with executives without becoming just another product team that works on the executive's pet project? So how do you get something that's valuable rather than some man or woman who's got too much power and is obsessed with something that's silly?
Yeah, it's a problem, but what the real answer to the thing is, we can take on the CEO and his pet project. If you're an employee, you can't. Right. So especially when the employees know that this project doesn't make any sense, but they have to work on it. So I think that we're good at storytelling, and so normally I'd say, yes, you could do that, which you want, but how about, 15 degrees off of that, diverted off of that is this, and then 30 degrees off of that, what you're talking about was this, and then like tell the story so well of the alternatives that it's not a meritocracy all the time, but a lot of times you can get somebody enthusiastic when it still has the DNA of the thing they wanted to do. It's just actually something worth doing.
So one way I've sort of seen that both at IDEO and the D.school, and in fact, the incubator project's a great example of that, because whatever the client was they thought they wanted an incubator, and in the way that the team shifted it was, well, it's the problem that the person's concerned with. So the problem in that case was not a better incubator. The problem was keeping babies warm.
Yeah, you tend to always go up one level higher to find what the purpose is, or what's really of value, and then you can come back down to it. If you start at the place where you needed low-cost incubator, you got a problem, right? Because you don't need a low-cost incubator, and some of the incubators were already empty anyway, so they were in the wrong place, right? So you can really change the thing, but it's usually you pivot to some place that's one level higher than what the person is saying the problem is. That's usually an answer. What they're saying is usually an answer, not a problem, right? And you need to get up to what's the problem.
Okay, we've got like 2 minutes. I can't resist this one. Somebody asked this one. So since you've done a lot of this, so how might design thinking processes help institutions of higher learning? So how could you actually get Stanford to change, or Berkeley?
Too difficult to climb at Stanford. Hard to. No, I mean, it's like what we do, right? It just takes longer. There's no money involved that you can use as a surrogate for what works and what doesn't work. And if you're at Stanford, we try to get made a new independent major out of our old major, but it took a lot of work.
It takes longer. I mean, one thing that I think that you've taught me, and I learned it from you and a famous organizational theorist named Jim March, that organizations, even large, complex ones, change quickly and easily, just not in the direction that any one person wants. And you've had Stanford change in a whole bunch of ways that just amazes me. The fact that the D.school exists, I still don't believe it exists, even though it's 50 feet from where we're sitting. I think that we are at close.